Welcome to the lecture on Stephen Rosenbaum's How to Be Dead and Not Care, a Defense of Epicurus. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll be looking at why Rosenbaum thinks that a number of proposed problems with Epicurus's famous solution to the problem of whether death is bad for the one who dies aren't successful. That is, we'll be understanding Epicurus's argument in detail in this lecture, and we'll be looking at what a number of people have said about the argument, and even further, why Stephen Rosenbaum thinks that these criticisms of Epicurus's argument are either unsuccessful or even further based on a serious misunderstanding of what Epicurus is up to. The prospect of death is at best a disquieting annoyance. It is at worst a terrifying mystery. However we react to the prospects of our deaths, we try to suppress our thoughts about death and live as if our time were endless. Long ago, Epicurus offered a remedy for our attitudes towards our deaths. He apparently argued that since death is neither good nor bad for the person dead, and since the fear of that which is not bad for one is groundless, it is unreasonable to fear death. Consequently, no one should fear death. If Epicurus were correct in this, we should perhaps try to revise our attitudes towards death. Epicurus's view has come under strong attack from various sources, but has not yet received a sound defense. I undertake to supply that defense. Rosenbaum is a professor emeritus at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. His research interests include ethics, the history of ethics, modern philosophy, ancient philosophy, and of course Epicurus and the philosophy of death and dying. This paper that we're talking about in this lecture, How to Be Dead and Not Care, is Rosenbaum's most famous paper. If you Google Rosenbaum's name, almost all of what comes up is responses to this paper. Since in this lecture we are also focusing on Epicurus, it's important to know who Epicurus was. Epicurus was an ancient Greek philosopher who lived from 341 to 270 BCE, and one of Epicurus's most famous followers, Lucretius, who we will also be talking about, was an ancient Roman poet and philosopher. He was the most famous original Roman Epicurean, the person who spread Epicurus's thought to Rome, and he lived from about 99 to 55 BCE. The issues that we're discussing in this lecture are issues that deal specifically with how we ought to live our lives from a practical perspective in a practical sort of context, and the philosophical subdiscipline that deals with how to live our lives in a practical sort of context is known as practical ethics. Practical ethics, which is sometimes also called applied ethics, is the subdiscipline of philosophical ethics that concerns itself with the moral properties and moral reasons surrounding specific types of actions, events, and states of affairs. The practical ethicist is primarily concerned with the moral properties possessed by specific types of actions, events, and states of affairs, but is not primarily concerned with the general ethical theory that determines those moral properties. So, while the practical ethicist might be able to tell you whether this sort of action or that sort of action is right or wrong, the practical ethicist is generally not concerned with the theoretical or abstract grounding of what makes those actions right or wrong. Instead, that's a project that's left to a practitioner of another sort of philosophy, that practitioners known as the normative ethicist. The normative ethicist is concerned with theories concerning what's right or wrong. Some of the sorts of questions, although not all of them, that are asked by the practical ethicist are: what's the moral status of particular sorts of sexual activity? What is the moral status of abortion? How should we treat non-human animals? What are the right and wrong ways for a nation to conduct a war? What's the moral status of specifically race-related questions? What's the moral status of specifically gender-related questions? And finally, what makes our specific sorts of lives go well or go badly? It's this final sort of question that we'll be focusing on in this particular lecture. In understanding what practical ethics is, it's important to contrast practical ethics with existentialism. Existentialism is a philosophical and literary movement that began mainly in Germany and France in the late 19th century. Thinkers like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre are among existentialism's most prominent figures. Existentialism requires a radically individualistic methodology, although it's not generally egoistic or self-centered, known as phenomenology. Existentialism is, in many ways, a philosophy of living, where living refers to the specific sort of thing that self-conscious, rational creatures do. While practical ethics generally gives us guidelines for how to live in terms of being good human people, and thus could be considered a philosophy of living, just like existentialism, it nearly always ignores the phenomenological methodology that's required by existentialism, and instead is more concerned with abstract moral principles and not concerned with individual experience. So the central difference between the practical ethicist and the existentialist is that the practical ethicist treats ethics as a sort of investigative discipline that can be practiced in a non-subjective, third-personal, general, universal sort of way, while the existentialist thinks that what we're investigating here, life, how to live, should be investigated via a first-personal, subjective, individualistic methodology. Since what we're discussing here is death, it's important to get clear on what we mean by death. We aren't here concerned with metaphysical or religious questions concerning whether persons are more than merely their bodies, or whether there's some part of a person that could possibly persist beyond bodily death. Those are very interesting questions in their own right, and philosophy does investigate those questions, but we shouldn't confuse those with our central topic here, which is the nature of death and whether death is bad for the person who dies. Death, as we'll use the term here, refers to the permanent annihilation of the subject. If I die, then I'm gone. Note that this is a stipulative definition, and no metaphysical or religious questions will turn on using the term in this specific way. When we ask whether death is bad for the person who dies, what we're asking is whether permanent annihilation of the subject is bad for the person who dies. Now, if somebody thinks that after bodily death we still exist in some way, maybe in a spiritual sort of way, then that person thinks that bodily death isn't actual death in our sense of the word. If somebody perhaps thinks that some part of us is immortal, then that person thinks that we never die in the sense that we're using death in this lecture. Thus, when we talk about death here, we're referring to one and only one very specific thing, namely the permanent annihilation of the subject being no more. A distinction that is very important when we think about and investigate the philosophical properties possessed by death is the distinction between being dead, death, and dying. The concepts surrounding death can be used imprecisely or equivocally, so it's important to be very clear with our use of the concepts of being dead, death, and dying. Being dead is the state one is in after one has died, after one's death. One is no longer around when they're dead. Death, on the other hand, is the instant when one dies, when one passes from being alive to being dead. However, death is also used to refer to the state of being dead, and in fact, it's generally used in this second sense in order to refer to the state of being dead. Context generally makes clear how the concept is being used. And finally, dying is the process undergone by the living that is a lead up to death. No dying person is dead. Another way to put that is, if you're dying, you're alive. Of course, in a poetic sort of way, we're all dying since we are all growing closer to death from the moment of birth. Usually, however, the concept is used in a more precise way to refer to whatever the final bits of a living person's life are. When we ask the question of whether death is bad, we might be asking that question in one of two separate ways, and it's important to keep these ways separate when we're talking about people like Epicurus. The first way is a philosophical way. Many, probably most people, think that there is something that's bad about death. And it's not just that death makes the survivors, the non-dead, sad. In fact, the relation goes in the other direction. It's the badness of death that is what makes the survivors sad. But if death is actually bad, then we should be able to find some reason why death is bad. Call this the philosophical question of the badness of death. What is it that makes death bad? One way that we might examine this question, and the way that's been most influential in the practical philosophical study of death, has been to look at the sorts of things that make other human endeavors go badly, and then to see whether death possesses any of those things, or at least things that might be relevantly similar to those things that make other human endeavors go badly. Human endeavors are bad or go badly for a number of different reasons. Chief among these reasons are someone is or some people are harmed, there's a lack of some good thing that should otherwise be present, and someone is or some people are deprived of something that it would be better for them not to be deprived of. We'll see examples of all three of these claims about death when we look at the people who are responding to Epicurus and claiming that Epicurus has gotten it wrong, that death is, in fact, bad. There's also an emotional way to talk about the badness of death. In addition to, and perhaps largely independent of that particular philosophical question concerning what it is that makes death bad, if anything, there's also an emotional question. Many, perhaps most people have negative emotions about death, especially about their own death. These emotions are generally related to the emotions of fear or anxiety. The emotional question concerning the badness of death is whether our negative emotions concerning death are apt, or instead, whether these emotions are misplaced. So the distinction between the philosophical question and the emotional question is that the philosophical question asks, is death actually bad, and if it is, why. The emotional question asks, should we feel particular ways, bad ways, about death? Now, of course, emotion is less susceptible to reason and argumentation than is belief. However, that doesn't mean that it is completely insensitive to reason and argumentation. We shouldn't think that given good reasons, we can't get some sort of comfort regarding what we used to think was a bad thing. Maybe even we can figure out why the thing we thought was a bad thing isn't so bad and thereby feel much better about that thing. Rosenbaum is concerned with defending Epicurus. Epicurus made an argument that death is not bad for the one who dies, and that therefore nobody should have negative emotional states with respect to their own death. So, Epicurus is tying together what we've called the philosophical question and the emotional question concerning the badness of death. Epicurus thinks that if something isn't actually bad, we've gone wrong. We're acting irrationally if we have negative emotional states with respect to that thing. In order fully to understand what Rosenbaum is up to in his article, it helps to recognize his argumentative methodology, that is, what he's doing, in what order, and why. That methodology looks like this. First, argue in favor of the soundness of Epicurus's argument. Second, defend Epicurus's argument against prominent philosophical criticisms. And third, offer a psychological error theory for why many people have mistakenly thought that death is bad for the one who dies. We'll be looking at what Rosenbaum is up to in his article in this order. Now notice the dialectical strength of doing things the way that Rosenbaum is doing them. Rosenbaum first tells us why we should believe that he's right. He then shows us why people who claim that he's wrong are mistaken. But he doesn't leave us there. He then gives us a diagnosis regarding why people might mistakenly think that he's wrong. This is a paradigm of an excellent philosophy article. Say why you're right, say why others are wrong, but then give us a diagnosis of why people mistakenly thought what they thought. Rosenbaum has his own reconstruction of Epicurus's argument, and it looks like this. Premise 1. A state of affairs is bad for a person, P, only if P can experience it at some time. Thus, P's being dead is bad for P only if it's a state of affairs that P can experience at some time. That just follows from 1. 3. P can experience a state of affairs at some time only if it begins before P's death. 4. P's being dead is not a state of affairs that begins before P's death. That just seems to follow from the direction of time. Thus, P's being dead is not a state of affairs that P can experience at some time, and therefore our conclusion is P's being dead is not bad for P. Rosenbaum has a particular interpretation of Epicurus's argument. It's a standard interpretation, but it's good to lay it out anyway. Any defender of Epicurus needs to settle on some particular interpretation of what, why, and how Epicurus is doing what he's doing. Epicurus isn't maximally clear in his writing concerning what he's doing. Without such an interpretation, a defense of Epicurus is at best muddled and at worst so conceptually confused as to be at the point of incoherence. According to Rosenbaum, Epicurus's main goal is to get us into a state of what's known as ataraxia, or robust tranquility. This tranquility is the highest human good, according to Epicurus's philosophy, and it comes from basing our beliefs and our emotions on philosophical reason and not believing things that go beyond what reason can tell us. Thus, according to Rosenbaum, Epicurus's goal is to answer what we have called the emotional question concerning the badness of death by first answering the philosophical question. So, Rosenbaum is tying these two questions together in Epicurus's argument. But the ultimate goal, he says, what Epicurus is really shooting at, is some practical conclusion about how we ought to feel about our own deaths. The first thing that Rosenbaum does after making some conceptual distinctions in his article is to support Epicurus's argument. It's important in understanding what Rosenbaum does here to understand just basically what philosophical, logical arguments are. Arguments are collections of one or more premises and a conclusion, in which the premises are supposed to provide support for the truth of the conclusion. Another way of saying that is that in a good argument, the truth of the premises is supposed to support or even guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Thus, in seeing whether an argument is sound, is a very good argument, we need to see two things. One, whether the premises really do support the conclusion, and two, whether the premises are, in fact, true. Rosenbaum reconstructs Epicurus's argument in a way that the premises do support the conclusion. So our job as philosophers is to see whether the premises themselves are actually true. The two premises that require the most support are the first and third premises. The rest of them either seem to follow from just definitions or instead just follow from other premises. Recall that the first premise said that a state of affairs is bad for a person P only if P can experience it at some time, and the third premise said that P can experience a state of affairs at some time only if it begins before P's death. We'll also see that the main criticisms of Epicurus's argument have come in terms of things that challenge either premise 1 or premise 3. So Rosenbaum is meeting his critics directly by first providing support for the premises that are most contentious. This concept of something's being bad for someone seems to be doing quite a bit of work in the argument. So what do we mean by that? Rosenbaum gives us a couple of examples to try to illustrate what's meant when we say that something is bad for somebody. He says, suppose that a person, P, cannot hear and never will. Then the egregious performance of a Mozart symphony cannot causally affect P at any time, supposing that what makes the performance bad is merely awful sound, detectable only through normal hearing, and supposing further that the performance does not initiate uncommon causal sequences which can affect the person. It is clear that the person cannot experience the bad performance auditorily or otherwise. Furthermore, it seems clear that the performance cannot be bad for the person in any way. It cannot affect the person in any way. The reason why it is not bad for him is that he is not able to experience it. The person's being deaf insulates him from auditory experiences which might otherwise be bad for him. Similarly, A person born without a sense of smell cannot be causally affected by, and thus cannot experience, the stench of a smoldering cheroot. That's a type of cigar. The stench cannot be an olfactory negativity for her. We could imagine indefinitely many more such cases. So notice here, Rosenbaum isn't saying that there isn't such a thing as badness, period. So, if the Mozart performance is an awful performance of the symphony, it's awful, period. However, if there's a specific person who doesn't hear the awful performance of the symphony, then that awful performance isn't bad for that person. We're talking about the badness for somebody here. So it seems that, according to Rosenbaum, something very specific is necessary for badness, and that thing is experience. Thus, says Rosenbaum, in order for something to be bad for someone, experience has got to be involved, and experiencing something requires at least that the purportedly bad thing has some causal effect on the person. This is entirely intuitive, and this evidence supports the two premises that needed supporting, 1 and 3. 1 is supported because 1 claims that experience is necessary for badness, and that's just what we saw here. 3 is supported because, while a person's corpse might be around after they die, so the corpse could be affected, they themselves are not around. If someone isn't around, then they can't experience anything. So we have an initial, very plausible couple of pieces of support for Epicurus's argument. Next, Rosenbaum turns to a number of proposed problems with Epicurus's argument and intends to show either that these problems are based on some sort of mistake or that they aren't problems at all. We'll look at 6 of the problems. The first is that Epicurus is not proposing a serious argument at all. The second is that Epicurus is competing with common sense, and that's problematic. The third is that things that a person doesn't know about or doesn't experience can still be bad for that person. Fourth, death is a loss to the person who dies, and losses are bad for the people who suffer those losses. Fifth, we can experience posthumous events while we're still alive, so the harm of death is experienced by us while we are still alive. And sixth, and finally, death is bad because the anticipation of death is bad. We'll look at each one of these in turn. It's important when we look at these to recognize that these are each different proposed problems. So even though I've given them in a numbered list here, these aren't just one problem that has 6 parts. So when we switch from one problem to the next, it's important to reset our argumentative faculties as best we can and look at the new proposed problem anew. Problem number 1. Epicurus is not being serious. According to Mary Mothersill, Epicurus isn't being serious in his argument. She says at best he's putting on a rhetorical show for us. Thus, the thought is, we shouldn't take his argument seriously. Problem, says Rosenbaum. Not only is there no reason to think that that's true, there's very good reason to think the opposite, that Epicurus is being perfectly serious. His other writings testify to this general view. In fact, what he's saying in his argument seems to be an expression of and completely in line with the overall philosophical theory of Epicureanism that he was the founder of. But even further, If Epicurus weren't being serious, we could still take his argument seriously and see whether there's any merit to it. People for thousands of years have thought that Epicurus had something in his argument, so even if everything that Epicurus was up to was some sort of joke, that wouldn't mean that his argument wasn't a good argument. We could still evaluate it philosophically. Second proposed problem. Epicurus contradicts common sense. According to Harry Silverstein, Epicurus's project is to take common sense very seriously and then to confront common sense with arguments against common sense. But this is a very difficult, he says, or even impossible philosophical strategy. However, Silverstein is misunderstanding the point of Epicurus's argument, says Rosenbaum, as well as of Epicurus's philosophy more generally. The point isn't to argue against common sense after taking common sense seriously, but instead to undermine common sense completely. Epicurus thought that common sense was often seriously misguided. His project was one of revising our common sense judgments by insisting that common sense be based not on knee-jerk reactions to things, but instead on good philosophical argumentation. Third proposed problem. Badness doesn't require experience. According to Thomas Nagel, from his famous article, Death, things can still be bad for a person even if that person doesn't actually experience those things. Thus, a person's death can be bad for her even though she doesn't experience anything when she's dead. Nagel gives a number of examples, so think, for example, if someone were spreading malicious rumors about you so your reputation was seriously damaged, even if you never experienced that person spreading rumors about you, and even if there were never any negative consequences for you, we might still think that what had gone on was bad for you, that it harmed you. So it does seem as though Nagel is onto something here. However, says Rosenbaum, Epicurus never claims that things can't be bad if they aren't experienced, but only that things can't be bad if they can't possibly be experienced. There's a difference here, conceptually, between something's not being experienced and something's not possibly being experienced. So to understand this difference, take this for example. While I'm recording this lecture, I am not in Japan. Things are going on in Japan that I am not currently experiencing, but I could experience those things if I were in Japan. On the other hand, if invisible, undetectable gorillas were to exist, I couldn't possibly experience them. So there's a distinction between something that could possibly be experienced but isn't, and something that could not possibly be experienced. Thus, Epicurus could just agree with Nagel that unexperienced things that nonetheless could have been experienced can still be bad for that person. But this does nothing to affect Epicurus's claim that things can't be bad for a person if it is impossible for her to experience those things. After you die, it's impossible for you to experience anything. It's not as though you could have experienced the things that happened after you died. So, everything that Nagel gives us as an example of things that are bad for us but that we don't experience, those are things that we could have experienced. Nagel doesn't give us any example of something that is impossible to experience but nonetheless is a harm. Fourth purported problem. Death is a loss and losses are bad. According to Nagel again, death is a loss of a good thing, namely life, and the loss of a good thing is bad for the person who lost it. However, Even if we're dealing with a sort of loss here, it's not a normal sort of loss, since in typical losses, the person who lost something is still around after the loss. In fact, what makes the loss so bad in these typical cases of loss is precisely Epicurus's point that experience of bad things is what's really bad. So, says Rosenbaum, we can't just use our intuitions about typical sorts of losses, ones in which the person is still around to experience the loss, in order to generate conclusions about atypical cases, ones in which the person goes out of existence at the moment of loss. Even further, by making the claims that Nagel does here, he runs up against Lucretius's argument. Recall, Lucretius was a follower of Epicurus's philosophy. Even if we have good reason to think that a loss of life is a bad thing, this doesn't prove that death is bad, since we have yet another reason in the form of Lucretius's argument to think that death isn't bad at all. Lucretius's argument looks like this. 1. The state of non-existence that we will be in after death is similar to the state of non-existence that we were in before we were born. 2. There is and was no reason to be afraid of the state of non-existence that we were in before we were born. Therefore, there is no reason to be afraid of the state of non-existence that we will be in after death. Now, Nagel could respond, as he has, that we couldn't possibly have been born any sooner than we were, so the time before our birth was not a loss of time that we could have been alive, but we could have died later than we did. So when we die is a loss of life. However, says Rosenbaum, there's no reason to think that if when we're born is essential to the people who we are, that when we die isn't also essential to the people who we are. The burden of proof is back on Nagel to prove that death is some sort of loss that matters. Fifth purported problem. The harm of death is experienced right now. According to Harry Silverstein again, we can experience the harm of our death while we are still alive. Now, this is for a somewhat complicated metaphysical reason that we don't need to fully go into here, but the reason is something like this. Events like death are considered by many people to be abstract objects that exist atemporally. This comes to us through the metaphysics of Plato, which is still very much alive today in philosophy departments in the form of metaphysics. So the thought is, even though we won't be around when we are dead, the event of our death is here right now because events are atemporal. However, these claims on Silverstein's part, says Rosenbaum, are based on a number of metaphysical confusions, the worst of which is that there is a difference between an event's existence and that event's occurrence. For example, if events exist atemporally, then Epicurus's death exists. However, Epicurus's death isn't happening right now. It isn't occurring. So even if something exists atemporally, that doesn't mean that it occurs atemporally or right now. So while it might be true that our deaths exist atemporally, that does not mean that they are occurring right now, which is what would have to be the case in order for us to experience them right now. Notice that Rosenbaum here is not just rejecting what many people might consider a really bizarre metaphysical view that events are atemporal. He's saying even if that's true, we still can't get to the conclusion that Silverstein wants. And finally, sixth purported problem, the anticipation of death is bad. Some people might claim that death is bad because of the harm that it causes during life via the anticipation of death. But this gets a whole bunch of things wrong. Two of the most important things that it gets wrong are these. First, if anticipation of death is bad for the person anticipating death, then that harm is a harm of a certain part of life, namely the part where death is anticipated. So it's not death, but a part of life that's bad. Even further, it's not necessary that we as humans negatively anticipate death. If this anticipation is a harm, then we should work positively toward recognizing that death is not something to anticipate negatively, and we should thereby make our lives much better. The thought is this: if anticipating death is so awful, then we shouldn't anticipate death in that sort of way. We're not required to. There are all sorts of people out there who don't negatively anticipate their own deaths. We should be like them. However, if we can't stop negatively anticipating our deaths, we should recognize that it's not death that's bad, it's a life of negative anticipation of death that's bad. So, Rosenbaum has looked at 6 potential problems with Epicurus and noted that they are false or based on confusions or totally unpersuasive. So far, we have looked at reasons why Epicurus is maybe right. And we've looked at reasons why people who say that Epicurus is wrong are themselves misguided. Finally, Rosenbaum gives us what's known as an error theory. An error theory is an explanation for why someone believed something false. The very best philosophical theories include an error theory so that they don't only show what's true, but also show why anyone would have been led to believe something false to begin with. This is a rhetorically very persuasive element of theories, since even if we recognize that our own position is false, it can often be difficult to give that position up unless we recognize that the emotions that are binding us to that position or theory are caused by something other than the truth of our theory. I'm sure you can think of times when you've had no good reason to believe something, and maybe you would even say, yes, I don't believe that, but you would still have a very strong emotional pull towards that thing. Well, if we can get an error theory that explains why we feel that pull, that gives us even more reason not to believe the thing. Rosenbaum gives us 3 of the possible error theories for why we may have been led to mistakenly believe that death is bad for the one who dies. Now, he doesn't fully flesh these out, and there may be more of them, but all 3 of them seem plausible. The first error theory. Many people who believe that death is the permanent annihilation of the subject also think that we are nothing more than our bodies. They then reason that since our bodies rot and putrefy after death, that they themselves must rot and putrefy after death. However, this sort of reasoning rests on a serious confusion between the notions of constitution and identity. Even if it is a fact that we are wholly constituted by our bodies, that doesn't mean that we are identical to our bodies. When we die, we go out of existence, even though our bodies are still around. So whatever bad thing might happen to our bodies after we're dead doesn't happen to us because we're not there anymore. Error theory 2. Whether we explicitly believe it or not, we almost certainly have some implicit attachment to the position of the survival of our own death. We are inundated, in our culture at least, with images conversational patterns, cultural rituals, etc., that are built around the position of the survival of death. The most popular religion in the world, Christianity, is built around the claim that we survive our own death. But since we don't know anything about what life after death could be like, the thought of it is at best something we have no understanding of, and at worst, something that causes terror. So what happens is we get these emotions mixed up with what we claim we actually believe, that death is the permanent annihilation of the subject. This results in negative emotions becoming attached to a thing, death, that is neither negative nor positive. So we get negative emotions from a position that we don't believe and attach them to the position that we do believe, and then think that the position that we do believe is a very negative thing. However, once we recognize this, we can be free of it. Error theory 3. For many people, dying can be a painful process. It might also be the case that the moment of death itself is very unpleasant, so there may be something to fear in dying or in death. As we well know, we don't generally think clearly about the issues surrounding death. This unclarity affects the basic concepts that we use in thinking about death. Those concepts are, as we know, dying, death, and being dead. We get emotions about one thing seriously confused with thoughts about another thing, and this leads us to attach the negative emotions surrounding death and dying to the concept of being dead. But this is a conceptual confusion. Once we recognize that we are confused, we can look at the issue aright. In this lecture, we've looked at why Rosenbaum thinks that Epicurus is correct, that death is not bad for the one who dies, and that we should therefore not be scared of or fearful of or anxious of death. We've also looked at why Rosenbaum thinks that the prominent criticisms of Epicurus are misguided, based on confusions, or just flat out false and unpersuasive. And finally, we've looked at 3 error theories that Rosenbaum gave us that could try to explain why we, rational people, have thought mistakenly that death is bad for the one who dies, and that therefore we should be fearful of our own deaths. If Rosenbaum is right, and if Epicurus is right, and if the critics of Epicurus are wrong, then this necessitates a radical reevaluation of our attitudes towards death. And since much of our life is lived in preparation for death, this might even further necessitate a radical reevaluation of our attitudes towards life. Thank you.